Welcome to the channel, guys. It's Weedle, and patch 1.2701 is coming out, which honestly sounds like a Star Trek star date, but hey, it's World of Tanks. And we're getting some buffs and some nerfs, and a couple of the buffs. Type 71, which has been a stinker since it entered the game, is getting a buff. M5Y is getting a buff, and the E100, also much to my surprise, is also getting buff. And a little bit of, to everyone's disappointment, the 60 TP is getting nerfed. We're going to talk about what these changes are. Are they warranted? Will the 60 TP still be good? Will the M5Y Type 71 E100 be competitive? Well, let's look at the numbers and see what they tell us, and let's take a guess of what's going to be good, what's going to be bad. Okay, so we're going to start with the losers of this patch, which is going to be the 60 TP, and unfortunately it's getting nerfed. And my first thought to this is, why is it getting nerfed? It's not overpowered. But let's be empirical about this, and let's see what the stats say it is. Now, if I was going to compare this to the other high alpha heavies in the game, and we're going to look at the 60 TP, the VKK, the E100 with the 150 millimeter, and we're just throwing in the BZ75 because it's got 650 alpha, so we'll throw it in there and do a little comparison. Now, this is pre-nerf, and a few things that kind of just stood out to me is, out of these high alpha tanks, it's got the highest DPM, it's got above average penetration for its standard round. It does have, a good rate of fire. Of course, it's got higher DPM. Another thing that I noticed was it has better dispersion than the other three. It also has more mobility than the other three. So it's not really a surprise to me that players are preferring this tank over some of the other high alpha tanks. And it shows on the EU server. I'm using the EU server for reference because there's just more players in the EU server. So you get a little bit more data to look at. It is the most played heavy tank at tier 10, which isn't really surprising to me. Like I said, it's a really good tank. And I think players are not dumb. They go to, the good tanks. How is this thing doing in the win rate differential? It's third, right behind the IS-4 and the Panzerkampf 7. So it is performing very well in the matches. What about damage per battle? Minus all the reward tanks, again, it is third, doing quite well. Okay, kills, looks like it's like fourth out of them. Which is, again, this isn't overly surprising to me. And another thing I noticed was, let's say we go to survival. It survives at the second highest rate of any of the tier 10 heavies. And all this is to kind of just point out that pretty much this thing is toward the top in every category. And while you might have noticed that the 50B and the E5 were up there in damage, they're way down here in survival rate. When you go to like win rate differential, even though when we look at it, they're the two highest damage tanks, you have to go down a little ways before you start getting to them. So, where's the 50B? It's actually quite a bit lower. Yeah, yeah, there it is. So from a performance standpoint, I kind of see where Wargaming is coming from. It's basically performing really well in all the categories that matter. And I can see why it's on their nerf stage. Now, what is this going to look like after the nerf? Well, this is kind of where I think they might have slightly overdid it. I think they could have knocked just maybe a half second off the reload versus almost like the 0.95, 0.9, whatever they did. And it would have had like the 2300-ish DPM, but it is pretty competitive with the VKK and E100 still, and it'll still be higher than the BZ75. They didn't touch a whole lot. The dispersion, aim time, same dispersion right here, 0.38. It's going to be the exact same as the VKK and the E100. Mobility, they're not touching. So I think the 60 TP is still going to be a good tank, but it is getting nerfed, and it's probably going to be more in line with the other tanks. It certainly won't be just outright better that choice than some of these in some situations, but I think it'll still be a good performer is what I'm kind of saying. So if you really enjoy the 60 TP, it's still going to be a thing. It's going to have about 180 less DPM per minute. That is going to affect it in battles from time to time. But much like the super nerf, ultimately I don't think it's going to do a whole lot to hurt the tank, but it is definitely going to bring, I think, its stats wise a little bit more in line with the average of other tanks. It won't be a top performer in every category anymore, or top 3-4 performer, which is basically where it is right now. Next up, a tank that honestly surprised me was the E100, and I really didn't think this tank was necessarily in need of a buff. But let's ask a question: do we want the tank to be in okay playable shape, or do we want it to be competitive? And Wargaming has said we want it to be competitive. So is this going to do the trick? Well, let's see what they did. The main thing that you're going to see, dispersion here and penetration. That's the biggest things that are going to change. It's now going to have 0.35 dispersion, and they buffed the penetration up to 255. I do like the penetration buff on the standard ammunition. I think that was absolutely needed. Definitely was a little low at the 246, so buffing it up to 255, hey, I'm all down for that. Better standard rounds, better dispersion will make this tank a little bit more reliable. I really like those things. Other than that, we're not really seeing anything else. Now, the big change, though, is the turret armor. And let's take a look at this and what's it going to do? Well, the big thing here is we see right here, you're getting around the 300s, and you basically had to fire premium rounds at this before. And it was balanced to probably around non-premium rounds because they didn't want non-premium ammo just shooting right through the turret. So they buffed it, and you had to fire premium at it. Well, the problem is when you fire premium at it, it's basically butter for all your higher pin tanks. So they've gone back and they've buffed it a little bit more. There's two things, opinions of this. Again, if they want this tank to be competitive, they have to buff the turret armor because it's such a big target that it's not going to be competitive as long as you can just point and shoot at it. And it's still going to have this weak spot up top, and my guess is some players are going to have to get very used to shooting that. If you don't have enough penetration, just go through the face. And don't get me wrong, this is honestly kind of like any other tank. If I was to look at a 60 TP, guess what? You got a little cupola on top of it. That's the spot you can basically pin. Other than that, there's a chance you can go through the face of it if you got pretty good penetration on your gun. But you're going to have to aim at weak spots. And, people keep wanting, weak spots on tanks. Well, there you go. There's your weak spot. Other than this turret will definitely hold up in battle. It'd be a lot more pleasant to play. Every time you look at somebody, they won't be able to just pin the face of the turret. So if they wanted this tank to be competitive, I think they did the right thing by buffing the turret armor. If they didn't want it, they would have left it, be competitive. They just left it the way it was, which was an okay tank. It certainly didn't frighten anybody in the matchmaker, let's be honest. Regardless of what you think of the buff to the turret armor, it was not frightening anybody. If you were a person that just liked shooting standard rounds, you weren't shooting at the face of it in the first place. You were shooting at this top little rail. So ultimately, I think it's a good change. I think it's a good buff. It will certainly be better in the matchmaker. It'll be a lot harder to deal with in certain situations. So I look forward to seeing how this actually works out. But overall, I'm on board with this. I don't think it's going to break the matchmaker or anything like that. It's still going to be much better to play. You're going to have to at least think when you're looking at it, trying to work in positions, catch it out of position. Those are all things you have to do. And when you're fighting another tank like a Super Conk or anything else, or Kranvang, you got to fight them in a situation where you can beat them. You're going to have to do the same thing with this tank now. Next up, we have the M5Y. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did a video on tanks that I wish Wargaming would buff. The M5Y and the Type 71 were on that list. And so I'm kind of getting my wish. And in that video, I mentioned that they should buff the 120. And my suggestion was pretty simple. Just make the 300, the premium round, AP round, and be done with it. They went a slightly different route, but they still buffed the 120 millimeter. And I thought that was actually a really good idea on this tank because the 105 just doesn't have enough alpha to make it feel like a heavy tank. It either had to have absurdly good DPM, or they needed to buff the 120, which could actually make trades with tanks. So the 120 is definitely, I think, the way to go with this. Now, what did they do? Well, they buffed the penetration on the standard round, which from 252 to 260. That's going to be very good. So if you're a player that likes to fire standard ammunition a lot, this is going to be an excellent choice for you. The other thing that they did, they buffed the dispersion. So prior, the dispersion was 0.36. After the patch, the base dispersion is 0.35. They buffed the DPM, so it's went up from 2500 to 2750 roughly. Again, this is going to be really good. But how's this tank going to compare with the Super Conch? Well, let's take a look. So as far as the Super Conch, which honestly I think this thing most resembles playstyle wise is the Super Conch. It's going to have higher DPM, higher base penetration, worse aim time, quite a bit worse dispersion, but overall, it's going to be faster than the Super Conch. It's going to have better armor than the Super Conch. I bet that weak spot on top is going to be a little bit of a problem, and it, regardless of how they do this, let me see if I can get this to go down. When it uses this 12 degrees gun depression right here, you're still going to have this weak spot on top. The cupola here is going to still be a weak spot. So anytime it's using its gun depression, it kind of even looking straight at you, I always found that this cupola is a lot easier to hit than the size of it would suggest. So I don't think that's really going to change. I was kind of surprised they gave this thing 12 degrees gun depression, because honestly, I didn't feel like gun depression was its problem. Is it going to be too good? We'll see. But I think overall, this is a good change. People are actually want to play this tank now. It probably won't be completely broken, because 310 on its heat round, honestly, is going to make it struggle against some opponents. So if you come up against, say, a E100 and you need to try to pin his face, you're not going to really be able to pin that reliably. You're going to have to be shooting that weak spot on top, which is much more difficult to hit. So this is going to be kind of a paper, rock, scissors thing. Sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it won't, depending on the situation it's in. It's always had the problem of when tanks get a little bit to the side of it, that you can penetrate the side of the turret, kind of like the Kranvong or any of the other kind of tank funnel heavy armor tanks like this. Like, from this angle, you're really not going to pin it except for the weak spot on top. But once you kind of catch it a little bit to the side, it's not too big of a problem. It's going to have times it's going to be really broken, and other times that teams are able to work together to kind of bring it down. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this. I think it'll be a lot more enjoyable to play. I look forward to seeing how it's going to look when it goes to the live server. So yeah, good. Thank you, Wargame. Okay, last but not least, we have the Type 71. So they buffed a few things on this. They buffed its mobility here. They buffed the cooldown mechanic on it, so it now will have from at least 0.28 to 0.22. So here's my thoughts on the cooldown mechanic on this tank. It was really never that good, was the problem. It was kind of, it was there, it was kind of nice when you had it up, but it wasn't worth like saving around to use. 0.22, however, will make this thing the most accurate tank in the game. And it's especially once you throw on like food and you have brothers in arms, that's going to be even better. So this tank will actually, I think, have a purpose and will excel at medium to long range engagements, particularly. It's still going to struggle at close range brawling, and I'm going to go into why in a moment. But prior, one thing with the life model, this was the problem with this tank prior, is this entire overhaul was so weak that everything just pinned it. And I know this says it's a weak spot. I've never really been able to pin right there. But the other issue was the cupola up here. Now, what they've done is they've now buffed this significantly. So if you right here, you can hit it, but if it's using its gun depression, that's going to be much more difficult to penetrate. Now, this is still a weak spot, and this cupola is quite easy to penetrate, and it's quite easy to hit. So I think still, even when this thing's using its gun depression, You know, we can see it right here. That cupola is still pinnable, and mostly because it's literally at the front of the turret. So that's not going away. And I think this thing will still suffer in brawling close engagements because of that. However, the fact that it can now be much more difficult to pin in the upper plate and it will be sort of able to side scrape, it's going to be a decent tank. I don't think this one's going to reach the state of competitiveness that some tanks have got in the past, but it will certainly be playable. And I think that's a good thing because this tank was absolutely unplayable prior to this patch. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this works out. Like I said, it'll be playable. It won't be great, but it'll be good. So that's it for this, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the nerfs and the buffs. Do you think the buffs are warranted? Do you think they overdid any of them? Are you upset about the 60 TP? I'm a little upset. I wish they'd left it alone, but I'm happy with all the buffs. I think these are all pretty good. They will all be much more enjoyable to play.